This is the moment Donald Trump's biggest trade gamble collapsed in front of the entire world. Not behind closed doors, not in a diplomatic cable, not in a quiet phone call between two leaders trying to avoid a crisis. In broad daylight, on camera, in front of every government, every market, and every military alliance partner America has left. As of 7:23 a.m. on Thursday, April 10, 2025, the White House confirmed that President Donald Trump had formally demanded that Canada hand over operational management of its 4 major port systems to the United States. The demand was not a suggestion. It was not the opening position of a negotiation. It was delivered as a condition: comply or face the full economic weight of the most powerful nation on earth. If you were standing outside the Canadian Prime Minister's official residence on Sussex Drive in Ottawa this morning, you would see something you have never seen before. Lights on before dawn, security vehicles repositioning, senior ministers arriving in unmarked cars before 6 a.m. The quiet, focused energy of a government that has just been handed a loaded political weapon and has decided, with full deliberation, to use it. Because here is what the White House did not calculate. Canada did not panic. Canada did not negotiate. Canada did not send a polite diplomatic reply through the back channel. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into an emergency joint press conference flanked by his finance minister and his energy minister, and delivered a response so precise and so devastating that commodity markets moved within 9 minutes of him finishing his first sentence. In this breakdown, we are going to show you what Trump actually demanded word for word and why every trade lawyer who read it went pale. We are going to reveal what happened inside the Situation Room when Carney's countermove landed. We are going to explain why this single confrontation may permanently restructure the energy relationship between the United States and its largest supplier. And we are going to tell you exactly what the next 30 days look like, because what is coming is not a trade dispute. It is a test of whether economic pressure can break a democratic ally. Trump is not just demanding ports, he is demanding submission. And Canada just told him what submission costs. 6 weeks ago, the strategy inside the White House seemed airtight. The plan was to use trade pressure, escalating, coordinated, relentless, to force Canada into a series of economic concessions that would reshape the bilateral relationship permanently. The port's demand was the centerpiece. The logic, as explained in internal memos that have since been described to journalists by 3 separate administration sources, was straightforward. Canada needs American consumers more than America needs Canadian infrastructure. Apply enough pressure on enough fronts simultaneously, and Ottawa will fold. The plan was supposed to deliver a historic win: a formal agreement giving American commercial shipping priority access and inspection authority over Canada's major port facilities, a restructured trade framework that locked Canadian supply chains into American first terms, and a political signal to every other trading partner watching from the outside that the United States under Donald Trump plays by different rules and wins on those different rules. He promised his base that this was the deal-making presidency, that no relationship, no alliance, no treaty was too sacred to renegotiate, that American leverage, applied correctly, was unlimited. But the cost of this plan was not just diplomatic. It was something deeper. It meant treating Canada, a NATO ally, the United States' largest trading partner, the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world, as a subordinate. Not a partner, not an equal, a subordinate that could be instructed to hand over sovereign infrastructure by executive demand. Canadian business groups warned their government. Retired diplomats warned the foreign ministry. 3 former American trade representatives, including one who served under a Republican administration, warned the White House privately that the demand crossed a line that Canada could not cross without a domestic political catastrophe of its own. Trump dismissed all of it. His advisors told him Carney was politically weak, dealing with a fractured parliament, facing an economy squeezed by earlier tariff rounds. They told him the timing was perfect, that a government under that much pressure would take a deal, any deal, over an escalation it could not afford. Trump gambled that Carney had no good options. He assumed wrong. At 11:04 a.m. Ottawa time, Mark Carney walked to the podium. The room was full, every seat in the National Press Theater taken. The diplomatic row was packed with ambassadors from the European Union, Japan, Germany, France, and Australia. The press gallery stands 3 deep. Outside, the temperature was -4 degrees Celsius, and the flags on Parliament Hill were snapping in a hard northern wind. Inside, the silence before Carney spoke was the kind that only happens when a room knows it is about to hear something it will remember. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform anger. He spoke with the calm of a former central bank governor who has sat across from markets in crisis and has never blinked first. The President of the United States has demanded operational control of Canadian port infrastructure, Carney said. Canada's answer is no, but our answer does not stop there. Then he announced 3 countermoves that did not just reject Trump's demand, they inverted the entire power equation that the White House had built the demand on. First, Canada would immediately activate its Sovereign Infrastructure Protection Act, emergency legislation tabled within the hour, formally prohibiting any foreign government entity from exercising scheduling authority, inspection rights, or operational influence over Canadian ports, rail terminals, or pipeline infrastructure, permanent, statutory, not subject to executive reversal. Second, Canada would redirect 18% of its crude oil export capacity, currently flowing south to American refineries, toward new long-term supply contracts with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. Effective in 90 days, 17 Canadian energy companies had already signed letters of intent. The infrastructure to do it had been quietly prepared for months. Pause. Third, Canada was suspending participation in the joint Canada-US electricity grid management framework that currently provides approximately 8% of peak power to the American Northeast, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, during high-demand periods, effective immediately pending renegotiation on Canadian terms. The announcements landed like 3 separate explosions in sequence. While Carney was still speaking, West Texas Intermediate crude oil futures spiked 8.3% in 11 minutes. Traders who cover the energy desk at 3 major investment banks later described the moment their terminals lit up simultaneously. Natural gas futures jumped 12.1%. The Canadian dollar, which the White House had predicted would weaken under pressure, strengthened 2.4% against the US dollar within the hour. While energy markets were repricing, the American Northeast power grid operators issued an immediate advisory. ISO New England flagged a potential supply gap for the coming week's demand forecast. The New York Independent System Operator convened an emergency call. Utility executives in Boston and Albany began running contingency calculations they had hoped never to need. And while utility executives were running those numbers, 7 Republican senators from oil refining states received urgent calls from the largest refineries in their districts. Gulf Coast refineries that process Canadian crude. Refineries that had signed 90-day supply contracts assuming Canadian oil would keep flowing. Refineries now staring at a 90-day clock and no alternative supply lined up. The market doesn't care about rhetoric. It cares about barrels per day and kilowatt hours. And in the space of 47 minutes, the market had told the White House something its own advisors apparently had not. Canada's leverage was not theoretical. It was physical, it was measurable, and it had just been activated. According to 2 people with direct knowledge of White House internal communications, an emergency meeting convened in the Situation Room at 12:38 p.m. Washington time, 94 minutes after Carney finished speaking. The participants, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, the Director of the National Economic Council, and the U.S. Trade Representative. The president was not in the room for the opening. He was joined by a secure phone from the residence at 1:02 p.m. The topic, as described by one person who was briefed on it afterward, was unambiguous. How bad is this? How fast is it moving? And what do we do? We have learned from a source familiar with the Treasury Department's internal assessment that the first briefing slide shown in that room contained a single number at the top, $127 billion. That is the annual value of Canadian energy imports to the United States. The slide beneath it showed the refinery map, 15 Gulf Coast facilities. Combined processing capacity for Canadian crude that has no short-term domestic substitute. According to this source, Bessent's opening statement was direct. We priced in a trade fight. We did not price in an energy supply event. These are not the same category of problem. The president on the phone reportedly asked the same question 3 separate times in different forms. Why didn't they tell us Carney could do this? Each time, the answer from the room was a version of the same thing. He could always do this. The option was always there. The demand is what made him use it. It was a cold calculation on Canada's side and a catastrophic miscalculation on Washington's. They looked at Canada's economic dependence on American consumers, real, measurable, significant. They looked at Carney's parliamentary position, genuinely complicated. They saw vulnerability on both counts. What they did not look at carefully enough was Canada's supply position. The thing America needs that it cannot quickly replace. As the call was wrapping up, according to one source, a senior economic aide said quietly to a colleague, "We handed him the weapon. We told him publicly, in front of everyone, that we need his ports. So he showed us what else we need." A pause in the room, then the call ended. Why did Trump make this demand? Follow the political logic, not the economic one. The ports demand was never primarily about ports. It was about dominant signaling, the same strategic instinct that drives tariff announcements at 4 a.m. and phone calls that humiliate foreign leaders in front of their own cabinets. The calculation is, if you can force an ally to surrender something symbolic and sovereign, every other country watching draws the lesson that resistance is futile. But here is where the logic collapsed. Trump is a product of real estate negotiation, a world where the person who needs the deal less holds all the power. He applied that framework to a relationship where the dependency runs in both directions, and he made the fatal error of revealing his own side of that dependency first, publicly, before he understood Canada's leverage over him. This shifts power permanently, structurally, not temporarily, from Washington to Ottawa. Trump can no longer negotiate Canadian trade from a position of pure pressure. Every future demand is now shadowed by what Canada demonstrated it can do: redirect energy, decouple electricity, and have 17 energy companies ready to pivot in 90 days. That readiness did not appear overnight. It was built deliberately, and it was revealed by the demand that was supposed to create submission. Sources close to the Republican Senate leadership tell us that 3 senior Republican senators from Texas, Louisiana, and North Dakota have privately communicated to White House liaisons that the energy countermove has created a constituency problem they cannot manage. Refineries in their states, energy workers in their districts, companies with contracts they cannot fulfill on a 90-day timeline. The legal dimension compounds everything. Canada's Sovereign Infrastructure Protection Act, tabled within hours of Carney's press conference, has already been reviewed by international trade law experts at 3 institutions. Their unanimous conclusion: it is bulletproof under international law. There is no WTO mechanism, no CUSMA provision, no bilateral treaty clause that gives the United States the legal standing to compel compliance. The demand was not just politically aggressive, it was legally unenforceable from the moment it was made. What historians will call this moment is already being debated in law journals and foreign policy institutes that published emergency analyses within 48 hours. This is not a trade dispute. This is the moment an American president discovered that economic dominance and physical leverage are not the same thing, and learned that lesson in the most public, irreversible way possible. Here is the domino effect. Follow it carefully. If Canada follows through on the 90-day energy redirect, and every signal from Ottawa says it will, then 15 American refineries must find alternative crude supply within 3 months. The alternative supply does not exist at that volume without bidding against European buyers who are also competing for the same Middle Eastern and West African barrels. The cost of that competition runs directly into American gasoline prices. Goldman Sachs issued a note within 24 hours estimating a potential $0.34 per gallon increase at the pump if the redirect proceeds at full scale. If gasoline prices rise before the midterm cycle, the political cost inside the Republican coalition becomes severe. If the Republican coalition fractures over energy prices, Trump loses the unified congressional support he needs to govern. That is the domino. 3 moves, all of them are already in motion. Beijing is watching this calculation with undisguised interest. Chinese state analysts have already published commentary noting that the United States just demonstrated it is willing to weaponize trade relationships with democratic allies, and that Canada just demonstrated that those allies can fight back with energy leverage. The lesson China draws from this for its own Taiwan Strait calculations is not reassuring. A distracted America, fighting its own allies over port management, is a less credible deterrent. Where is the business community that Trump built his political identity around? Silence from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for the first 6 hours. Then a statement that described the situation as deeply concerning without mentioning the president by name. The American Petroleum Institute, whose members depend on Canadian crude flowing south, issued a statement calling for immediate diplomatic engagement, not supported, not defense. A call for someone to fix what has been broken. The CEO of one of the largest American refining companies told investors on an emergency call that the company was evaluating supply alternatives, which in refinery language means they do not have one yet and they are scared. 3 major shipping industry associations jointly called on the administration to withdraw the port's demand and return to standard bilateral negotiation frameworks. This fractures the coalition Trump needs most. On one side, the nationalist base that wants to see dominance over Canada and reads Carney's response as a provocation that demands escalation. On the other side, the energy industry, the refining sector, the manufacturing supply chain, and every Republican senator from a state where Canadian crude feeds local jobs. Those 2 sides cannot both be satisfied. A coalition divided between escalation and de-escalation cannot hold the line heading into the next budget fight, the next Supreme Court confirmation, the next foreign policy crisis. Reports from 2 White House correspondents describe a president who, by Thursday evening, was making phone calls after midnight to advisors, to Republican senators, to the trade representative, asking variations of the same question, not what is the strategy going forward. The question he reportedly kept asking was simpler and more revealing. Why did nobody tell me about the oil? Staff have been instructed not to put economic briefings shorter than 4 pages in front of him. The energy secretary has requested a direct meeting that has not yet been scheduled. The president is described by one source as locked into the public position, unwilling to back down visibly, but without a legal or economic mechanism to force Canada's compliance. The port's demand is not just a policy mistake, it is a map, a publicly displayed, permanently recorded map of exactly where American supply chains are vulnerable, which allies hold physical leverage, and how quickly a democratic partner can restructure decades of trade dependency when pushed hard enough. Every foreign minister on the planet now has that map. Every future negotiator sitting across from an American trade representative has that map. It cannot be undrawn. The demand that was meant to project American strength instead became a global tutorial on American vulnerability. Trump wanted to rewrite the rules of North American trade in America's favor. He ended up rewriting Canada's negotiating position for the next generation. You can reframe a tariff. You can spin a diplomatic setback. You can call a failed threat a strategic opening move. But you cannot spin 17 Canadian energy companies signing letters of intent to redirect oil to Europe on a 90-day timeline. You cannot spin natural gas futures jumping 12% in 11 minutes. You cannot spin the New York power grid issuing a supply advisory because Canadian electricity is being withheld. Some consequences are too physical, too measurable, too immediate to reframe. This is one of them. So where are we tonight? Donald Trump is in the White House residence making late-night calls that his own advisors have described as unfocused and repetitive. The Treasury Secretary has turned on him, not publicly, but in the language of emergency meetings and 4-page briefing memos that nobody asked for before this week. The refining industry has turned on him. The Northeast utility sector has turned on him. 3 Republican senators from energy states have turned on him. Not publicly yet, but the calls are being made and the language is unambiguous. He is the most powerful trade negotiator in the world. And tonight, he cannot make Canadian oil flow south. That is the paradox. And that paradox is now on the front page of every major financial newspaper from London to Tokyo. As we head into the next 30 days, watch for escalation that gets louder as the options get narrower. Trump will likely try to reframe this as a national security issue, attempting to invoke emergency powers over energy imports to create legal pressure where economic pressure has failed. He may try to announce a counter-sanctions package against Canadian goods, accelerating a tariff war he is not currently winning. He could even attempt to use NATO framework language to argue that Canadian energy redirection constitutes an act of economic hostility against an alliance partner, a legal argument that international lawyers have already described as having no foundation. But what cannot be undone is the 90-day clock. The letters of intent are signed. The The European supply contracts are being structured. The electricity suspension is active. Canada has not just said no to Trump's demand, it has engineered a situation where the cost of maintaining that demand grows by the day, and the political pain lands squarely on Trump's own coalition. Subscribe, because we are tracking this 90-day energy clock in real time. We will go live the moment the first Canadian crude tanker redirects to a European port. We will break it down the instant any Republican senator makes a public statement against this administration's position. This is not background noise. This is the central fault line of American trade policy right now, and it is cracking open faster than anyone in Washington predicted. Share this with someone who thinks this is just another trade argument. It is not. It is the moment a G7 ally demonstrated that submission is not the only option, and that the cost of demanding it can be paid in barrels and kilowatts. Watch closely. The 90-day clock is running.